Labor, and actually I'm going to start again. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gil McGowan, and I have the great honor to serve as president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the AFL to the latest installment of our ongoing Lunch and Learn series. Before we dive in, as is our practice at the AFL, I'm going to begin this session with a reading of the Alberta Federation of Labor's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Alberta Federation of Labor respectfully acknowledges that we are meeting today from points all across the province, including Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory. Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities. Treaty 7 territory is in southern Alberta, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Nation, Siksika, Pakuna, Kainai, Tutsina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and Treaty 8 territory, which is a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This territory provided a traveling route and home to the Cree, Dene, Inuit, as well as the Métis and many others. We recognize the history of oppression of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples in their traditional land across Canada, and we are committed to doing the ongoing and active work of reconciliation. The Alberta Federation of Labor also recognizes that we are all treaty people with treaty obligations, and we are committed to living in committed to continuing living in accordance with the spirit and intent of peace and friendship that is foundational to the treaty relationship. As a labor movement, we will actively work together in solidarity to end oppression and seek justice for all peoples on this land. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us. Also once again, on behalf of the AFL, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of the AFL's ongoing Lunch and Learn series. Over the past few months, we've hosted conversations on healthcare, education, procurement, and the unfolding energy transition. Today, we'll be turning our attention to the topic of taxation. Specifically, we're going to talk about the system that we have here in Alberta for generating revenue to pay for public services like education, healthcare, municipalities, and basically all the public services that keep our province running. This has been a difficult conversation for Albertans to have in the past, partly because of the way it has been framed by many of our political leaders. In particular, and if you're a long-term Albertan, you'll remember the phrase, the Alberta Advantage, which came to mean Canadian standard services at below Canadian standard taxes. Somehow we were sold this notion that we could have our cake and eat it too. But today we're going to dive into that and have a discussion about whether or not that's true and the problems that come from believing that you can have it all at a lower price in terms of taxes. We were just reminded today about just how out of step Alberta is with other provinces when it comes to generating revenue to pay for public services by a tweet that was posted by one of our most prominent economist, Trevor Tome, from the University of Calgary. He posted one of his famous charts based on information from Statistics Canada that was just released today, so hot off the presses, detailing from the Government Financial Statistics Report for 2021, and the chart in particular that I think is notable for our conversation today had to do with the share of provincial GDP going to pay for public services, both provincial and federal. And basically every other province takes about, between 14, 15, 16% of their economy. They collect in taxes, both provincial and federal, to pay for public services. Here in Alberta, only about 7.5% of our GDP is collected by federal and provincial taxes. So we are an outlier. And that creates challenges for our province. So to discuss those concerns and those challenges, we are joined by two distinguished guests. The first is Bill Kilgannon, who is a familiar face to those of us in the labor movement. Bill is currently a founding partner in a firm called Real Impact, which is an agency supporting change through advocacy and strategic communications. Before that, he served as the interim executive director of the Parkland Institute from July 2020 to 2022. And he was returning to that role, having served as Parkland's founding board as executive director. Bill had previously worked for the Council of Canadians as Director of Campaigns and Communication. He was also the first Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta. And during the term of the Notley government, he also served as Chief of Staff to 3 ministers. So welcome, Bill. We're also going to be joined today by Gillian Petit, who is a senior research associate at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. Gillian holds a PhD in economics from the U of C and also a law degree from Queen's University in Ontario. Her research focuses on Canadian income and social supports, as well as tax policy for low income and marginalized people. So we've asked Bill and Gillian today to make a presentation to us about their work on revenue reform. And the presentation that you're going to see today is entitled what I would do with $15 million. So that's a takeoff on the old bare naked ladies. If I had $1 million in this case, they're going to answer the question, what would we do if we had $15 billion? And this is work that is an extension of work that they've done on a campaign that many of you are familiar with called the Better Way Alberta campaign, which was launched a couple of weeks ago. So if you're interested, a lot of the stuff that they're going to be talking about today is reflected in a fact sheet that is available on the Better Way Alberta website. So you can go back to that after the presentation for reference. But with that, just a couple of ground rules here. We're going to spend about 25 minutes with Gillian and Bill hearing their presentation. Then we'll move on to some questions. I'll start by asking a few questions as moderators, but we also want to open the floor up to everyone who's participating and joining us today to ask their questions. We would ask that if you have a question, you would write it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, all the controls for managing this platform are at the bottom of your screen. So just take your cursor down to the bottom, and then the function should appear. And if you look sort of just left of center there, there's a Q&A function. If you have a question when it comes to that time in the agenda, please use the Q&A function, and then as moderator, I'll read that out. There also is a chat function, but we ask you to put your questions in the Q&A so that we just don't miss anything. At this point, I'd also just like to thank a couple of our staff members who have helped organize this event and who are with us today. Both MC and Beth from the AFL staff are here to keep the trains running on time, and I thank them very much for this contribution to this event. So with that, let's turn things over to Bill to begin the presentation for this afternoon. And thanks, Bill and Gillian, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gil, and thanks to everyone at the AFL for hosting this and putting this on. We're really pleased to be joining today. I am just going to quickly share my screen so you can see that. Hopefully everyone's able to see that. And yes, Gil is right. Although he didn't sing it, I was hoping he was going to sing. If we had $15 billion, what we really want to talk about today, though, is fair revenues for quality public services. And so why does this matter? So we'll just jump right in here. I am really pleased to be presenting with Gillian Petit. I'll do some introductory comments, and then we're going to have her speak to the income tax work that she did in partnership with us for this fact sheet that's on the Alberta campaign. So I'll just start with some introductory comments here about why this matters and why people should care about our revenue system and how it's structured. So if you look through the media, you obviously see there's all kinds of issues with respect to public services, more Alberta hospitals, services unavailable due to staff shortages, increase in Alberta education budget, lags growth, rising costs. This is impacting on every aspect of our lives. Post-secondary education, we are seeing massive cuts to our universities, colleges, technical institutes, and of course that's driving up tuition for students on into the future. And Alberta has a very significant issues with respect to poverty. And so in cities across this province, we know child poverty and poverty, homelessness are very serious issues. And so this, of course, all relates to what we can collectively do through our government and our taxation system. But not everyone is struggling in Alberta. In the country, Canada's CEOs saw a massive increase with respect to their salaries. In the last year, they had a 23% increase. Median bonus for Canada's CEO last year, the median was $1.95 million. So not everyone is struggling, to say the least. Canada's oil patch, of course, here in Alberta is also, as we all know, doing incredibly well, thanks in large parts to the war in the Ukraine and the massive increase that we've seen in the last year and a bit for the price of oil. So, and of course, that has led to a surplus situation for Alberta, and the government is already sort of talking about, well, what we need to do is put that money into debt reduction rather than into public services. So what we want to talk about today, though, is that what we can do is to change how we approach and change the conversation on our revenue system. We have 5 key areas that we want to talk about with respect to options that people need to understand that would make a significant difference. Will, depending on how it was applied, total between $5 to $15 billion in sustainable ongoing year-over-year funding that could then be invested in public services. So the first of that, which Gillian will get to right away, is talking about what a progressive income tax system will look like. Secondly, we'll talk about corporate taxes and making sure wealthy corporations pay their fair share. Then we'll talk about excess profits and how those excess profits could be used to support Canadian families. Fourthly, we'll talk about making sure that we're adjusting our royalty rates and making sure that we have better minimum and more progressive royalty rates for the future. And finally, we'll look at some of the jurisdictions around the world, and in fact here in Canada, about what it would mean to establish a tax on wealth, as well as a tax on luxury goods. So in my experience, a lot of people don't even have a clear sense of how much revenue Alberta brings in. So before turning it over to Gillian on income tax, I did just want to provide this overview, which is straight from the government's own budget, and adds in the final column there the update for August 31st. And you'll see a huge difference where currently bringing in just shy, or projected to bring in just shy of $76 billion. The estimate, the budget for this year that was done a few months earlier, though, projected a $62 billion revenues, etc. And I think it's important to just sort of ground people in that as we're talking through, so you get a sense of the scale and the context of how much each area is bringing in. So for instance, you can see that the income tax is bringing in just over $13 billion, where corporate taxes are projected to come in at $6 billion. Notice that the government was actually projecting corporate taxes to go down, but because of the high oil and gas prices, et cetera, you'll see that they're now projecting it to go much higher. And as we'll talk about later on, bitumen is huge, doubled in the amount it's projected to bring in this year, up to $20 billion. And other resource revenue, as I described it, that's largely revenue from gas, more than doubled in their projections. So that's why we have such a strong surplus situation. But as everyone who's lived in Alberta knows, the boom bust cycles come and go, and that's why we need to talk so much about sustainable resources going forward. So the next chart here is also something straight from the Alberta budget, and it is something that they put in every year, and this basically shows how much Alberta could bring in if it had the same tax structure as any other jurisdiction in Canada. And so you see off the top there, if we had the same tax structure as Ontario, we would bring in $14.8 billion more. Saskatchewan, 17.4, BC, 20 billion, all the way up to Newfoundland at $28 billion more that could have been brought in. Now, the dark blue line there is sales tax. Alberta is the only jurisdiction, of course, without a sales tax. Sales tax are an important conversation, but we chose to focus on all of the other options because we know that oftentimes everyone zeroes in on whether we're going to have a sales tax or not. An important conversation to have, and some research has been done on that and maybe how to do that where you're not impacting on low-income people. But what we're focused on is how can we increase sustainably our taxes in other areas to make it more fair. And so that's where we'll launch into those 5 key points. And I will now turn it over to Gillian to walk through all the work she's been doing on the income tax system. So over to you, Gillian.
All right, thank you, Bill, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to talk about how we can implement a more progressive income tax system here in Alberta. So next slide. Okay, so just as a reminder, we're taxed on our taxable income. And to get to taxable income, you take your total income. So that's your market income. So things like wages and salaries, your investment income. And from that, we minus any deductions. So deductions can be contributions to RRSPs, claimable childcare expenses, moving expenses, and union dues. And after we take off those deductions, we get to our taxable income, which is then taxed. Next slide. So in Alberta, we have a somewhat progressive income tax system. So from 2019 to 2021, we've had the same tax brackets and the same tax rates. So in our first tax bracket, people who make under $131,000 are taxed at a rate of 10% on their taxable income. Then between 131 and 157, you get taxed at a rate of 12%. Between 157 and 209, you get taxed at a rate of 13%. Between 209 and 315, you get taxed at a rate of 14%. And our top tax bracket, so that's people making over 315K, anything over 315,000 gets taxed at a rate of 15%. Next slide. So as I said, from 2019 to 2021, we've had the same tax bracket and the same tax rate. So in 2019, Finance Minister Travis Towse announced that we would be freezing the Alberta tax bracket. And this isn't done in any other province. So other provinces and the federal income tax brackets all adjust for inflation. And we used to too, prior to 2019 when they were frozen. This is one way to increase revenue, but we think about it more as a tax increase by step. So what's essentially happening here when we freeze the tax bracket is that, say you're making just under 131,000. So you're paying 10% income tax rate, and then there's inflation. The cost of goods and services goes up. And say you're part of a nice union, or you saw your annual increase of 3% on your wages. So your wages increase, the price of goods and services increase, but because they're increasing about the same, you can continue to buy after this adjustment the same package of goods and services. However, when our tax brackets are frozen, what happens is that although before tax we might be able to buy the same package of goods and services, after taxes we can buy less goods and services. And that's because of taxes, because your real tax rates have increased. So this is considered a tax increase by stealth. So next slide. So looking at 2021, the Alberta government, because they froze these tax brackets, they made about $183 million more than they would have had the tax brackets not been adjusted to inflation. So this averaged to about $80 per average taxpayer in Alberta. Next slide. So this is one way to increase revenues, but it's not a great way to increase revenues. It's not transparent. Most people don't know what it means to have their tax brackets frozen and their real tax rates increase. It affects all taxpayers as well. So both low and no income tax filers, as well as high income tax filers. This is because when the government froze the tax brackets, they didn't just freeze just the tax brackets. They also froze a bunch of benefits and a bunch of the tax credits. So for example, the Alberta Child and Family Benefit was frozen at the same time. So for those collecting that benefit, the real value of the benefit decreased between 2019 and 2021. Now, as of September, the Alberta government has announced that the Alberta tax brackets and credits are once going to be adjusted for inflation again in the 2022 tax year. They've announced that they're increasing the tax brackets by 2% for the 2022 tax year. This is in contrast to the federal government, who will be increasing the federal tax brackets at a rate of 6% for the 2022 tax year. So Alberta is still a little behind on this. Okay, next slide. So we think, though, there's a better way to increase revenues from personal income taxes in Alberta. And one way to do that would be to continue to index our tax brackets to inflation, so they adjust with inflation. So no taxation by stealth, but instead we adjust the tax rates. So what this means is that for our first tax bracket here, so those making under 131,000, the current Alberta tax rate is 10%. We suggested that tax rate stays the same. So there's no change in the tax rates for the bottom earners. But then in the second, third, and fourth tax brackets, so for your higher income earners, we suggested adjusting the Alberta tax rates and bringing them in line with the BC tax rate. So for those in the second tax bracket, between 131 and 157,000, the tax rate increases from 12% to 14.7% in line with the BC tax rates. You can follow this all the way up. So up in the top income tax brackets, those making over 315,000 a year would be increased from the current Alberta tax rate of 15% up to the BC tax rate of 20.5%. Next slide. So if we do this, if we adjust these tax rates like this, in 2022, Alberta would see an addition, would increase the provincial tax revenue by an additional $1.26 billion. So that's quite a bit of money. But now the question is, who pays and by how much? Next slide. First off, most tax filers in Alberta are not going to be affected by an increase in tax and this type of increase in tax rate. So only 6.6% of Alberta taxpayers are in the top 4 tax brackets that see the increase in the tax rates. 93% of Alberta tax filers are in the first tax bracket, and thus wouldn't have their tax rate changed. Next slide. In terms of dollars, if we look at the left-hand graph here, we can see that those in the first tax brackets see a very negligible change in their taxes owing. But those in the top tax bracket see a relatively large change. So they would owe an additional $28,000 in taxes in 2022 if we adjusted to the BC tax rates. But when we look at it as a percent of taxable income, the increase isn't that large. So if you look at the right-hand side graph here, you can see that in the fifth tax bracket, so in the top tax bracket, if we increase the tax rates in line with BC rates, the personal income taxes as a percent of taxable income would increase from about 37% to about 41% for those in the top tax bracket. And note that these taxes are all provincial taxes, federal taxes, payroll taxes, all of this. So their total tax burden would be 41% of their taxable income. Next slide. And finally, if we increased the Alberta tax rates in accordance with the BC tax rates, such a move would fall more largely on men. So if we look at the left-hand graph shows what percent of women and what percent of men are in each tax bracket. So in the first tax bracket, we see 48% of tax filers are men and 52% of tax filers are women. So women dominate in the first tax bracket. But if we move up the tax brackets all the way up to the fifth tax bracket, we see by the fifth tax bracket, 85% of tax filers in that tax bracket are men and only 15% of women. And this is largely because of selection into industries and occupations that differ across gender, the gender wage gap, women not in the labor force, not as active in the labor force, or more likely to be in part-time jobs. So there's lots of stuff behind that. And then if you look at the right-hand graph as a percent of income, so even for women in that top or fifth tax bracket who would be most affected by the increase in tax rates, even then, oh, I feel like my second one is backwards. I am sorry. Sorry, my second one is backwards. It should say men pay an additional $31,000 in taxes owing, where women pay an additional $15,000 in taxes owing. I will change that for later, but yes. So women would end up still paying less of the average change in taxes owing compared to men, because women still earn less in that tax bracket than men. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Gillian, for that. It's really important for people to understand just how other provinces have way more progressive systems, and how we need to be able to match those high-end costs. BC was one example that we looked at, but there's other provinces, of course, are significantly higher. I'm going to go through the other points now just very quickly. We recognize we're moving quite quickly through these. We do want to get to the Q&A discussion where we can go into a little bit more depth. But when it comes to the second options that Albertans have to look at how we bring in a fairer and more sustainable amount, I think most people here should know that Alberta had in 2019 a 12% corporate tax rate, and that they've accelerated the decrease, the promise by Jason Kenney to cut it down to 8% much faster than they had originally envisioned. It's also important when talking about this to just really make sure that people understand the distinction between corporate taxes and small business taxes. So small businesses make up the majority of businesses in Alberta, and actually the NDP government cut the small business tax by 1/3 from 3% down to 2%. So we're talking about large corporations here receiving a very large tax break from the UCP government. So from 2019 to 2021, we wanted to look at how much that tax cut actually impacted the revenue, the bottom line going forward. And we worked with the economist Troy Cochrane from Canadians for Tax Fairness. So he crunched the numbers and calculated that had the UCP government not cut corporate taxes and left the rate at 12%, the government would have received an additional $6.3 billion in total over those 3 years. So that is a very significant amount. Of course, and Kirkland Institute recently came out with a study by one of the research managers, Ian Hussey, that also looked at how the the big four oil sands corporations benefited from the tax cuts. And what Ian was able to determine by doing deep readings of all of their their annual reports is in total over those same 3 years, $4.3 billion is what was saved by the tax cut that Jason Kenney brought in. So these are significant dollars that could have been going into helping support our healthcare, our education, and all our other key public services. Troy also did some analysis looking at how Alberta compares in terms of our effective tax rates. So it's one thing to say, well, you pay, this is your tax rate, and you would think everyone would pay the amount. But of course, corporations have many ways of reducing their taxes, loopholes, other things. Obviously, they're set up to do that. And Alberta's effective tax rate is significantly lower than it used to be, and way lower than the national average, as you see in that chart there. And then he calculated to say that actually, had they at the 12% rate, had they actually collected the total amount, it would have been $27.8 billion, i.e. an additional $16 billion over the last 3 years. Could have been collected if we were collecting the full rate rather than the effective rate. Turning to the next section, there is looking at cost relief for Canadians, and I think it's really important to look at what other jurisdictions are doing. The government of the UK in May of last year brought in a special windfall profit tax on their oil and gas companies of 25%. And when I was prepping for this, I noticed that just last Thursday, actually, the announcement came from the new Prime Minister, who used to be the Exchequer in the UK, that they're increasing that windfall profits tax on oil and gas to 35%. And they're also applying it to electricity generators. And what they're doing in the UK is they're taking that projected 60, works out to about $22 billion Canadian per year. This headline is in American dollars. And so they're using that to address the massive inflation issues in the UK. So here in Canada, the federal government is also moving ahead for the first time and applying a one-time 15% special tax on banks and insurance company profits that made over $1 billion last year. And so that's come out this year, and it's projected to raise nationally $6.1 billion over 5 years. So again, we have options. The federal government is moving ahead on addressing some of these excess profits, and then hopefully using that to support people who are really struggling these days. Troy also did an analysis of where Alberta's corporate profits are going. And as you can see from this graph here, the last 3 years, corporate profits have really shifted to going back to stockholders. There's, as if you read the business news, you see all the time they're share buybacks, they're putting a lot more money into shareholders' pockets than into the pockets of Albertans. And this is one of the main things that Ian points out in his excellent study, that is that rather than the oil companies and these major companies taking the excess profits that they're gaining and putting that into expanding their businesses and creating more jobs, we're actually seeing a lot of that going into automation, which is in turn reducing jobs in the energy industry. And so I think it's very important people understand that it doesn't just these tax cuts don't lead directly to job increases and stuff. And as you're seeing there, those profits are going to shareholders, many of whom don't live in Alberta, and so that's a big options that we need to look at. Moving on to the fourth point, this is a really complex subject. I'm going to just gloss over in some very major complex themes here, but it is important for people to understand that obviously you saw how much money is coming in from our royalties, very significant, and will continue to be very significant for many years to come. And that has to do with how this royalty structure is set up. And so we use what's called the revenue minus cost approach, where the royalty is paid based on once the costs are paid for, then the royalty is everything over and above their profits, and then it's set based on payout rates. So before a company has paid off all of its expenditures, it's in what's called the pre-payout period, and the royalty structure that we have in Alberta is 1% on revenues up to $55 a barrel. And that rises if the price of oil goes over $50 a barrel, up to 9% at $120 a barrel. Once a company has paid out all of its expenditures, it moves into what's called the post-payout period. And that is one of the major reasons why we're seeing such a massive increase in our royalties going forward. Is a lot of the major companies are moving into what's called the post-payout period. And there they pay 25 to 40% of net revenues going forward. So that looks great, and it looks, we look like we're raising lots of money, but and indeed we are. But are we getting our fair share? That's the fundamental question. Well, British Columbia just went through a royalty review earlier this year, and well, they're didn't go perhaps far enough for on many issues, to say the least. They did make some significant changes, and I think it's very important for Alberta to look at what that would mean here. We know that in BC, they actually used to have their minimum was 3%, where Alberta was 1% for our pre-payout. They moved their royalty system now to 5% is the minimum that they pay. And as well, they got rid of some subsidies, particularly on deep well drilling that used to be there. So they're estimating to increase their annual revenues by 200 million by these minor changes that they did. And keep in mind, the Alberta oil and gas industry is significantly larger than British Columbia. So if BC is able to do this, we think it's definitely time for Alberta to be looking at how we can increase particularly our minimum rates while the prices are high, so that when the prices go down, we're not in this boom bust cycle where all of a sudden we're having to cut healthcare spending, etc., going forward. So we can get more into that in the Q&A. It's complicated, but it's good. And finally, the fifth point is to look at establishing a tax on wealth, as well as a tax on luxury goods. And so in the federal election, there's been a number of things looked at federally. The political parties, both the New Democrats and the Liberals, were musing about that in the last election. We will say that polling that was done at the time showed that there's 89% across this country support for a wealth tax. So the Parliamentary Budget Officer put together a report in September 2021, just based on a very simple calculation of 1% on tax on net wealth of more than $10 million. And this would generate $60.7 billion nationally over 5 years. So roughly $12 billion more a year nationally. We worked with economist Alex Hemingway from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He had previously in 2021 modeled something that was a little bigger, 1% tax on net wealth over $10 million, 2% on anything made over $50 million, and 3% on money made over $100 million. I don't know how many of you here listening today would be in those tax brackets, but not me. But that would raise a significant amount of money as well. He projected $363 billion over 10 years, sort of escalating up. When you think about it, if Alberta is getting, if Alberta is 11% of the population of Canada, that federal money could be divided and go towards the increased costs of healthcare, et cetera, that we're looking for. And then finally, the federal government has moved forward on some wealth tax changes and vacant homes. And September 1st of this year, any of you buying a car over $100,000 will have to pay an increased tax on anything you spend over $100,000. Or I know, Gil, you're planning on buying a yacht, I think, at over $250,000. So sorry, you're going to have to pay some extra tax on that yacht that you're planning on getting. And that is projected to bring in $163 million more federally for the year. As well, they put a tax on vacant homes owned by foreigners, and that is $175 million projected in federal funds for next year. So we see in the media, just wrapping up here, our own premiers across this country saying, "Oh, the federal government, it needs to give us more money for healthcare. We're so poor, we can't afford to have proper healthcare, etc." But Trudeau recently pushed back, saying, "Well, you know, yes, we may put more money into the Canada Health Transfer, but it's, you know, here the media is picking up on these issues, saying." Particularly Alberta, it's very challenging for Alberta to be saying, look, we need more money from the federal government to go to our healthcare when we are turning around and providing massive tax cuts for corporations and for wealthy individuals. So in closing, the Better Way Alberta campaign, which is in partnership with the Parkland Institute, Public Interest Alberta, Friends of Medicare, and the AFL, is really hoping to stir a conversation about revenue reform and why it's so important to invest in our key public services. As I'm sure you all are aware here, we have an election coming up. So how can we make sure that fair and sustainable revenue reform is an election issue? As you see, it's central to all of these other points. So it's critical that we be looking at making sure that all political parties, I would say in particular, we need to challenge the, well, obviously our sitting party, the UCP, although I'm not going to hold my breath too much on Danielle Smith, but we would love to see some real commitments from the NDP on what they're going to do with respect to revenue reform, because we can't keep moving forward without some substantive revenue reform. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Gil. Thanks, everybody. Stop share.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. And thanks, Gillian, for a really enlightening presentation. For those joining us, just a reminder, as Bill said, this presentation is a summary of work that Bill and Gillian did as part of what we're calling the Better Way Alberta campaign. So if you haven't already done so, please, after this session, please visit the Better Way Alberta website. So it's betterwayalberta.ca. And on that site, you will see a fact sheet summarizing this presentation. You'll also see fact sheets dealing with a range of other public policy issues that we're trying to put on the agenda for public discussion in advance of the next provincial election. And as Bill said, the whole point of the Better Way Alberta campaign is to try to encourage / force our political leaders, including the New Democrats, to start talking about policies that will actually make our province better. This particular conversation, I think, is in some ways foundational to all the others. because without public revenue, the range of options that are available for consideration on all the other areas that we're concerned about, whether it be education, healthcare, post-secondary education, the range of options are limited. That's by design. This is not just an economic discussion; it's very much a political one. And what we're dealing with here is an extension of the strategy that has been used to great effect over the past 40 years by conservatives, in Alberta and Canada, and indeed around the world. They call it the starve the beast strategy, right? They know that that citizens generally really like their public services, and so going after those public services in a sort of full frontal assault is difficult. And so what they've adopted instead as a strategy is to demonize taxation. Taxes are bad, governments don't spend your money well. And so the idea is to, discourage people from supporting taxation. And then once there's fewer taxes on the table, they say the cupboard is bare, we have no choice but to cut. So this is all about, lowering expectations, getting people to accept that austerity is inevitable. But one of the things that we're trying to do with this work that was just presented and the broader work that we're doing through Better Way Alberta is to basically make the point that this is a choice, right? And I think that in Alberta, the choice is particularly clear because we've got a $13.4 billion surplus right now. We have the potential, as Gillian and Bill just showed, to have much more sustainable revenue every year. So we can think about having better things. And I think that's one of the takeaways is that don't let them tell you that we can't afford it. And I think that and that goes both for the UCP and the NDP. So we're hoping that all the policy prescriptions that you've seen today, we're going to try to do everything we can to convince the New Democrats to include some of these policy prescriptions in their platform leading up to the election, and should they win, in their government policies afterwards. So with that, I'm just going to begin by asking a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the floor for Q&A. The first, actually, I guess this question is for Bill, but maybe Gillian might want to weigh in. When we first started this conversation about revenue reform to pay for quality public services, we were in the midst of a recession caused by collapsing oil prices, and debt was going up, and so the argument that we couldn't afford things was easier for conservatives to make. But as both Gillian and Bill have just said, we currently have a $13.4 billion surplus. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives put out a report suggesting that looking at the finances of all the provinces, and for Alberta, they said, and this is a quote from the report, that that there will be surpluses in Alberta as far as the eye can see, largely because of what Bill was talking about, the post-payout situation. Like most of our big oil companies, which are oil sands companies, which the 6 big companies that are responsible for 85% of our production, almost all of their projects are heading into post-payout. So they're automatically paying a dramatically higher level of royalties. So I guess my question is this: given the fact that that there are going to be surpluses as far as the eye can see, does that mean that we still have to consider making changes to the stuff that you guys have been talking about, like income tax and corporate tax and wealth tax? And I guess I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate here. If there's so much money coming, why do we have to do these other things?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Gil, because we know that people will go, oh, look, we have all this wealth, and therefore we can be we don't need to touch our taxation system. Now, why it's so important that people become literate in these issues is to be able to then counter that and to recognize that in other jurisdictions around the world, They are using their wealth from their energy industry, etc., for long-term investments on into the future, and are not depending on that to then cut taxes. Norway, of course, is the classic example that Parkland Institute has studied and talked about a lot with respect to their wealth fund that they have created, which is now over $1 trillion. They're not putting that money back into their core public services. They are using their taxation system to make sure that they have a fair but ongoing sustainable system. So now is the time actually to be driving forward this conversation to say we need these changes to come in so that in the future, all of the money coming in through oil and gas and changes that are happening vis-a-vis climate change and the important shifts that are going to be happening in our global economy, that we're not 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out back in a situation where we're seeing massive cuts to our public services, but that we've invested in it over the long term. And so I think it's vital that we counter this notion that, well, we're so wealthy, we don't need to make sure that our taxes, and that well-income or well-off people and incredibly wealthy corporations need to be able to pay their fair share. But perhaps Gillian, you might have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just say I grew up in Alberta, so for as long as I can remember, we've ridden that royalty roller coaster, the boom bust, right? When times are good, times are really good, and when times are bad, we cut all expenditures on everything. And I work at the university, so we're running on really on smoke right now. Increasing revenues from a variety of different sources will just help to diversify our revenues, and it's just more sustainable when inevitably we hit the bottom of the roller coaster again.
Thanks very much, Gillian. I would just add one other thing, which I think is important because for a lot of people, they don't understand that royalties are not they're not taxes, right? And royalties are a price that we as the owners of the resource charge to the companies who develop the resource. And so by keeping resource revenues really low, we're basically giving away an asset at bargain basement prices. An argument could be made that that's necessary during tough times, to keep these companies going. But when these companies are making literally record profits, and the price of oil is very high, and they've paid off all their costs at the same time, which is the case for most of our big oil companies, it's not just harder to make that argument, it's kind of unconscionable, right? I mean, I think, Peter Lougheed, who was premier in the 70s and 80s, was famous for saying that we need to think like owners. What he meant is that we own the resource, and we should bargain for the best possible price for it. And so when people say, well, the money's rolling in, we don't have to make any changes, I think that's underselling ourselves, and we're giving away an asset at lower price. If anyone who said that you own an asset, you have a business, it just doesn't make sense to continue doing what we're doing, regardless of how well the economy is doing. So we should just think of it as a business transaction, and whether the business is going well or not, you shouldn't be giving away your assets, which is essentially what we've been doing. The other question, and this is sort of another devil's advocate question, whenever we talk about taxes in Alberta, invariably the response from conservative politicians and pundits is that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem, and that we need to deal with the spending problem first, and then we can talk about revenue. So how would you respond? How would you guys respond to that question? Either one of you.
Gillian, do you want to take that one first? Or?
Sure, I can take it. I would argue it's a both problem. So I don't know if you recall the Blue Ribbon panel, I can't remember the year, 2018 or 2019, and they had gone over all the expenditures. I mean, they were limited to looking at expenditures or at spending, and they, they made arguments that spending in all these areas needed to be cut because in Alberta, we pay more per capita than other provinces. But I think what was missing from that conversation is the quality of services we have. Just because we pay more per capita, it doesn't always mean that we should cut spending, because then we might be also cutting a lot of our quality. So there's a spending problem, but there's also a revenue problem in Alberta. And I don't think, again, when we hit the bottom of the royalty roller coasters, we always blame it on spending, but we never think about diversifying our revenue so we don't hit the bottom so hard. And then when we hit the bottom and we cut our spending and, things come out of our income and social support, out of our universities, post-secondary education systems, it's really hard on everybody.
Yeah, I would just jump in the few minutes that we have left to say that, they year over year, you might cut spending in some areas. Say you want to cut post-secondary education. The long-term impact on students, on our economy it needs to be considered as well. And so investing in people and resources, healthcare, education, etc., is an investment in the future. And so we need to shift the language around how we talk about that. Yes, there are ways that we can make things more efficient, but actually investing in those upfront things actually save the economy, save people, and make for stronger communities and healthier communities in the future. And that needs to be the central point at which we're arguing for these investments and how vital they are for us going forward. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Gillian and Bill. Well, we're almost at the end of our session. There was only one question in the Q&A, and that was about whether or not we would be making this information more widely available. And the short answer to that is yes. We're recording this session. It will be available on YouTube shortly. And so we will continue to distribute it as an educational tool. But in addition to that, there are two related campaigns that will be running from now until the next provincial election. The first we've mentioned already, the Better Way Alberta campaign, but the Alberta Federation of Labor is running a similar parallel campaign called Workers Demand Better, which is workersdemandbetter.ca. And in both of those campaigns, the labor movement through Workers Demand Better, and then civil society with the support of the AFL through Better Way Alberta, we are going to be trying to encourage people to, take these issues seriously in the lead up to the next election. So there will be articles, there'll be blogs, there will be social media posts, there will be shareables, based on the research that both Gillian and Bill have done. And so hopefully we are going to get people talking about these things. The issue of the surplus and revenue and how we pay for our public services, I can't see how the parties can avoid it. And on a hopeful note, I would just point out that the New Democrats at their convention in October announced that they were bringing in a very prominent economist, Todd Hirsch, former head economist for the Alberta Treasury branches. He's retired now, but he's agreed to basically help the New Democrats prepare policy related to revenue and the surplus. So that's very hopeful, and so I actually am going to see if we can make sure that Bill and Gillian get an audience with Todd so that that their work can be fed into that process. And that was one of our goals here, was to try to get at least one of the parties including these ideas in their platform in the lead up to the election. So I'm just going to quickly give Bill and Gillian just a minute or two to wrap up if they'd like, and then we're going to have to say good afternoon. So maybe we went to Bill first before, so maybe I'll go to Gillian first and then Bill, and then we'll wrap things up. Gillian?
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to say. I think these are all really important ideas going forward of how to make our revenue base more sustainable and diversify away from royalty revenues. And I think it should be a hot topic coming with the upcoming election.
Okay, thanks very much, Gillian. And Bill?
I'll just say thanks to you, Gil, and the AFL and all the partner groups, Parkland and PIA and FOM, for sort of moving it forward, and anything we can do to help to keep that conversation going. This is going to be super vital, and help everyone who's attended today has been given some tools, some information where they can I see Tony's point in the chat about Danielle Smith potentially coming out with changes to the personal income tax system. So we'll see what that is, and we will hopefully see some letters to the editor and some counter positions, because I'm sure she's going to be spreading some goodies without actually touching on making our system more fair and sustainable and progressive. So thanks again to everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Well, this is a government that has a history of introducing harebrained ideas like flat taxes. So if she does something like that in her address to the province tonight, then both of you will have a lot more to talk about, as will we through our campaigns. But once again, thanks for a really insightful presentation, and for all the work that went into the presentation, the fact sheet, all the work that you guys are doing around these important issues. And so thank you for joining us, and thanks for everyone else for joining us. Look forward to those of you who join us to join us again for future lunch and learns. And then I'll just one final plug: betterwayalberta.ca, betterwayalberta.ca. That's the website. Please visit and read the fact sheets and share them with your friends. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.